At the Environmental Research and Education Foundation, we advance scientific research and create educational pathways that enable innovations in sustainability. Our unbiased, peer-reviewed research makes critical information readily available to all. Our scholarship program fosters the next generation of researchers who will continue to provide critical research and data well into the future. We're expanding to become a data repository for everyone working toward viable, implementable solutions for a more circular economy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our science session, Unwrapping Recycling in New York City for the holidays. Before we really kick things off, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. All participants have been muted, and if you have any questions for our speakers, you can ask those via the chat function. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat function, and through that, an EREF staff member will be able to assist you. To access slides from today's presentation, please take a moment to locate them in the handout section in the control panel, and there you'll find the PDF document available for you to download. And if you'd like a certificate of completion, please be sure to attend the entire webinar, and an email with a link to the certificate will be sent to you. So, well, there are your housekeeping notes in case you want to read through them again. And now we're ready to go ahead and get started. And I'd like to welcome you to this EREF science session, Unwrapping Recycling in New York City for the holidays. So I'm Susie Waxman, I'm the Director of Programs at EREF, and we're really excited to have you all with us. And I am really thrilled to announce our speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Hewitt, who is an Associate Professor in the Department of Technology and Society and Associate Director of the Waste Data and Analysis Center at Stony Brook University. She is an urban planner and social scientist, and her work explores human processes that impact energy, waste, and resilience in buildings and cities. And Dr. Hewitt's research has been awarded over $10 million in external funding from a range of sources, including EREF. And so with that, Dr. Hewitt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I think just kind of kicking off the questions with hopefully something that's pretty easy and providing some background for your research. You know, what inspired you to do your research, and what inspired this research in a big city?
Sure. So I'm an urban planner, as you said. So I generally love cities, but specifically in terms of the environmental problems that I study, cities are in many ways both the problem and the solution. They're kind of the gift and the curse, right? So they present greater challenges because of their population density and huge influx of goods and materials and an outflux of waste. But at the same time, that density gives us so many advantages if we know how to leverage it and how to leverage cities. Cities are more walkable. People rely less on cars because of the density and the ubiquity of high-rise buildings, multifamily buildings. There are, economies of scale and efficiency gains and heating and energy use and on and on. So recycling is particularly challenging because the behavior doesn't have any price signals in multifamily buildings. And we know that recycling rates are lower in the multifamily segment than in single family homes, but there is evidence that people might engage in pro-environmental behavior even, without a monetary driver due to, the sort of sense of pride, a sense of place attachment, environmental responsibility. So cities are just really interesting juxtapositions for me, both of incredible challenges and also incredible potential. So
Interesting. Well, and so your research, you do social science-based research, and in this case, it's on social norms. So, could you tell us a little bit more on social norms and recycling behavior and explain what they actually are?
Sure, that's a great question. So social norms are defined as an individual's perception or belief about kind of the acceptable behaviors of other individuals within their peer group. So we know that social norms can be influential mechanisms for behavior change because as human beings, we tend to kind of naturally compare ourselves to others. And we tend to shift our own behavior to conform more with what we perceive as the norm.
Well, and then, what did you find in your research about social norms on recycling and recycling behavior?
Sure. So what I was looking to test, so one common way to take a step back to engage those social norms is through a feedback mechanism. So that's where some data or some information about a particular behavior, whether that's a good behavior or a bad behavior, is communicated in some way. So that's either visually or graphically or through some readable material to the target audience. Feedback can be data about that target group itself, or it can compare that target group to some other group. And so some existing work has shown even stronger results with that comparative type of feedback, where you're kind of engaging that peer mechanism. So we were looking to test both of these types of feedback in the multifamily residential segment in New York City. So we worked with a property management firm, and we identified 2 buildings that were both managed by this firm. So that allowed us to control for any characteristics of the buildings that might otherwise vary if we chose 2 random buildings. And for 12 weeks, we conducted an intervention where one building received a comparative social feedback and the other received the non-comparative feedback. So in the comparative building, residents were exposed to weekly graphics in their trash rooms. The trash rooms were on every single floor, comparing their weekly recycling performance to their neighbors. And this was based on the prior week's data that we were collecting from building management. And then in the non-comparative building, residents received notices in their trash rooms providing weekly data for their building only. And each poster combined graphics and text, and they were designed to be nearly identical to one another, except for the specific data points included. So you can see this on the slide. This was 1 week of our interventions. And of course, we couldn't do this alone, so we collected some other data to kind of complement these interventions. I mentioned weekly recycling data, so we collected counts of bags of plastic and metal recycling and counts of bales of cardboard for each building. This was provided to us by the building. We also had a team of students who actually sorted 4 times, both municipal solid waste and recyclables, so that we could assess contamination of the streams. And then we conducted a few surveys of residents during our time in the study.
And so thanks for explaining kind of the background of what you were doing, and what did you end up finding?
So what we found was that in the comparative feedback building, when we took those bags, the number of bags, and we interpolated the weights based on the weights that we got during our sampling events, there was in fact a statistically significant increase in the amount of recycling right after our intervention period, which we did not see in the non-comparative feedback building. So this sort of showed us that feedback was effective, but that comparative feedback, which is more likely to activate those social norms that we talked about, seems to be more impactful. And this provides more evidence to kind of support other studies that are out there using this social comparative feedback. But we've seen this in other work on, a college cafeteria, in single family homes, but it's somewhat understudied and really challenging in multifamily buildings. So we were kind of interested and excited to see those results.
Yeah. Was anything of the results particularly surprising?
Yes. So in fact, what was really surprising to us is that although we saw that statistically significant increase in recycling after our intervention, there was also an increase in contamination. So I have some visuals you can see where municipal solid waste is contaminated with recyclables, and vice versa. We had recyclables that were contaminated with things that should have been thrown away. So given that uptick kind of correlated along with the increase in recycling and our interventions, it seemed to us like residents were trying to recycle more, but there's still this misunderstanding about what can be recycled, and residents are trying to recycle things that were not actually recyclable. So still a problem.
Well, and then one thing I also, as I was rereading your final report today, what was kind of the long-term trend? I believe you also did some additional repeat testing or looked at this, after the end of the study period. And so how did these trends last through time?
So in the comparative feedback building, we saw that increase in recycling persist for quite some time, and then it did decrease again. And then in the non-comparative feedback building, we did not see the increase, and we, saw just a sort of straight line. So, but we did, we sampled again, after our study ended, And we did try to get a kind of a persistence assessment for how that was playing out over time.
Yeah. And is this pretty standard that, you know, once you do an education intervention, it's usually helpful, but doesn't always keep the effect that you were looking for?
I think that's pretty well known in the literature. It's why you do some sort of a follow-up or a persistence assessment. You know, in order for habits to be ingrained, they really need to be repeated for a very long period of time, or at a point of kind of transition in people's lives. They're more receptive to changing their behavior. So it's very easy to kind of fall back into old patterns and habits.
Yeah. Well, and so you did kind of those surveys in the initial phases, and then did the actual physical measurement of looking at what people are doing. So, you know, can you speak to whether or not what residents' behaviors or what their intentions were from the surveys, whether or not that matched what they actually did?
Sure. So we did conduct a few surveys. We conducted a survey at the beginning of the study, kind of like as a baseline assessment, and then we conducted a survey after we completed our interventions altogether. And we were trying to understand if people even noticed our interventions, if they saw them, right? And what we found is that generally all of the residents are really positive about recycling, and they report that they think it's very important, that they do it all the time, you know, daily. It was really difficult for us to track if that played out in the actual recycling data, because we were unable to collect recycling data on a household by household basis. So that leads to just a really interesting kind of follow-up research pathway for how can we repeat a study like this where we actually do have household by household data. Most multifamily buildings collect recycling on a floor by floor basis, so that's challenging, but it certainly could be done and would give us really interesting kind of granular data. But what we do know from lots of existing research in many fields, you know, energy and environmental behavior and recycling, is that there is something called an intention behavior gap. So people make intentions to do certain things or to undertake certain behaviors, but there's, for many reasons, a gap often in whether that intention carries out to actual action. So, you know, all kinds of things can intervene into whether people actually perform the behavior that they intended to perform. So my hypothesis is that we would find something similar if we were able to gather recycling data on a household by household basis.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so for this work, you know, who was influential in the work and thinking about recycling? If you were going to improve recycling in multifamily buildings, you know, what stakeholders are really key in order to making those changes?
I think in the multifamily segment, the biggest stakeholder is really the building manager, because they're just directing so much of the day-to-day activity in a building. The distinction there is that some buildings are really well staffed and have really high capacity to drive these kinds of initiatives, and other buildings just don't have the resources and the capacity to do that. Which then the follow-up there is that the big stakeholder is obviously, you know, the government and policymakers, and how can they allocate resources to the buildings that do need additional help and capacity to drive these kinds of efforts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the building managers are really key in kind of the specific building case, but to be able to have this be functional in a national way, it's really going to take more government action.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so if we're thinking about the national picture, you know, can this be applied to other cities or other areas?
I think absolutely, but I think one of the key takeaways from our work is just how context specific these types of interventions are. So you can't, it's not a one size fits all sort of intervention. Buildings vary so much, even within the same city. So you really need to take into account, you know, the structure of the building, the number of residents, the capacity of building management. Is it really a high-end building, or is it more of a lower-end building? In New York City, for instance, New York has, I think, the highest rate of co-ops in the country. And cooperative buildings are structured very differently than rentals. They're still multifamily, but the residents actually own a share of the building itself, right? So there's a very different kind of economic motivation and kind of investment in the property to manage these efforts in a different way. So I think the sort of takeaway is that this could be replicated, this type of study could be replicated in many different ways in many types of buildings across, various cities.
I mean, do you think there are other constraints though? I know in our kind of pre-planning conversation, we were talking about like, well, what cities would work? And I think kind of the takeaway was it really is, we're looking for like this particular work, big cities, like ultra major cities. Do you think that that's still true? Because, we're based in Raleigh and it was, maybe in the multifamily buildings here, it wouldn't necessarily really apply, but we're really looking at some of these really big residential spaces.
Yeah, I think you do need the density in a way, right? Because in a large city like New York, the buildings are so big and have so much capacity to do things, to drive efforts. They're almost like their own little microcosm of a community that's independent from the outside. So and you don't see that in a lot of smaller cities. So I do think you need to take that into account for this type of intervention. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so are you doing other work? Are you looking into other buildings or other places?
There's lots of sort of proposals in progress, I think, for thinking about how to replicate this or how to ask some different questions around the multifamily segment going forward. And of course, this is work that originally I think came out of energy, right? Energy efficiency. But the social norm piece is much clearer because there's a clear price signal. You get your monthly electric bill. So there was a little bit of a stronger evidence base for using these kinds of social norm interventions in a residential context. So just in thinking about my future work, how can we, better test these types of interventions in waste and recycling? Where can we test them? What types of buildings? So I'm looking at all of that, and hopefully we'll have some more projects in the future.
Yeah, well, and so I guess maybe the co-ops play into this, but even like condominiums, is that a situation where maybe you would see those price signals if the specific resident is paying for their trash pickup, then it would be more effective.
Yeah, exactly. So condos are kind of in the middle, right? So you've got the rental segment where in my mind, I almost envision residents as customers, right? They're paying rent for services essentially, and have an expectation for the building doing certain things for them. Condos are kind of in the middle. That's where individuals own their unit in the building. So there's certainly more of a sort of shared sense of responsibility, I would imagine, for the building and for how recycling is managed, and probably any fees or fines by the city are distributed, I would imagine. But then co-ops are even more so, because the structure is not just your individual unit, but you actually own shares of the entire building, right? So you're actually a part owner of the whole building. So I think that really does kind of engage more of that responsibility and the kind of collective, the social collective. You're really running the building with your neighbors, which you don't see in a rental building. So I think the outcomes would be really different with this kind of intervention in that type of building.
Well, and so one of the other questions I have here, I mean, we sort of touched on it a little bit earlier of, are there any policy implications in your findings? And certainly there are, but can you speak any more about like what those could look like?
Sure. So, I think cities are often thinking about where to allocate resources and how best to improve recycling rates. And, one really important takeaway here is that there should be kind of a weighting of need, so to speak, right, for the buildings that really are under-resourced and understaffed and don't have capacity to remove recycling twice a day from the trash rooms, and to sort it when the residents don't do it correctly, and all of that stuff that comes along with the kind of higher end buildings. And so if cities want to be really effective in policy for increasing recycling, really it needs to be targeted to specific building segments that are are most in need of additional capacity, I think.
Well, and so then one other kind of additional question, just thinking about the social norms work. I think I kind of saw that a lot of this is usually applied in more a neighborhood level. And so can you talk any about the differences between doing social norm work at a neighborhood level versus a multifamily building, or does it really translate, or how does that apply? Or even thinking about terms of recycling in a neighborhood level and like curbside collection versus multifamily and that, and how these social norms and kind of the comparative model really would impact those sorts of spaces.
I think it's much more challenging in the multifamily segment, which is why it's kind of understudied. And this is going back to when we were talking about my survey and just not having household by household data. In the multifamily segment, I can't think of a situation where you could easily collect from every single household in a 600 unit building to be able to track any kind of intervention success. And so extending that thinking a little bit, multifamily residents kind of know that they just dump the recycling down the hall and somehow it will magically get sorted. Not that they're not making an effort. I know many people are making an effort, but the visibility and the accountability that you have when you're in a smaller building or you're curbside recycling in more of a neighborhood context is just not there when you have, a 600 or 700 unit multifamily building in a really large city. So yeah, the expectation I think is that the building management will handle a lot of it for me. If I dump all my dirty pizza boxes in the paper recycling, they'll throw it out if I didn't know where it should go. And the kind of accountability or that there's anonymity, right? You don't know who's doing it from your floor. You don't know who's contaminating the stream. So there's a lot more, I think, behavioral errors that can slip by in the multifamily segment.
Right. Yeah, that's 600 families in a pretty small space is a pretty big difference. Just even trying to like collect and sort all of that trash when you only have a tiny loading bay in order to be able to for that to be a logistical challenge.
Exactly. Yeah.
But that's pretty interesting, and that's a problem with recycling in general, right? It sounds like it's compounded in a multifamily building of that lack of accountability leading to contamination. But I mean that does happen everywhere. But it's just the density of cities that can help solve the problems, like you said at the start, really is also contributing to a lot of issues if it's not used effectively.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, so thinking about these dense urban spaces and a time of surplus, thinking about the holidays and all of the shopping that's probably going on in New York City, and everybody's Christmas trees and events and festivities and things that are going on. How do you think that will impact multifamily buildings, and what waste and recycling issues do you see kind of in New York City around this time of year?
Yeah, so I mean, as you mentioned, it's just going to be kind of an influx of deliveries and boxes and packaging. So I think for the multifamily segment, for building managers in particular, it's even more important for managers to think really strategically about how to get residents to put things where they should put them and sort appropriately. So, we had some ideas coming out of our study that maybe bins should be labeled with what not to put in them, right? Which is kind of an easy low-hanging fruit, but it's not really being done. Usually you see the blue bin for plastic and glass and metal, and then you see the green bin for paper, and maybe there's a sign on it for what to put in there, but nothing that tells you what not to include. So maybe really big graphics and really impactful signage could help there. And to kind of build on the peer piece of this and the kind of social norm piece of this, I think we do have some really engaged residents in multifamily buildings, and if that engagement could be leveraged as kind of a a peer leader or some sort of a leadership role, excuse me, either on their floor or as a committee within the building. And this obviously takes some effort and it takes some planning and some time, but I think there is really potential there to leverage these social norms in a way that can really bring people together and have people being more accountable to one another, because I think that's really a big piece of it, the accountability.
Yeah. So, and I remember, that was sort of one of the things that you weren't able to do. We didn't really talk about this, but you were doing your research kind of at the height of the pandemic, so it was something that you definitely had to adjust on the fly. And I think having some of that community, that personal interaction was something that you wanted to look at more, but weren't necessarily able to due to restrictions at the time. Do you think that, or I guess, do you know of other work where you've seen that and seen that be effective? And do you think that's what you would have seen had you been able to actually do it in your study?
Yeah, so I wish that we had been able to do that, but as you mentioned, we had a lot of workarounds we had to implement due to COVID at the time that we were doing all of our field work. But we had wanted to do kind of a peer leader mechanism in one of the buildings and have people kind of be asked to step up and guide for their floor or for a couple of floors in their building, and we weren't able to do that. I do think that would have changed things a little bit. I think the visibility would have been there a little bit more. The accountability would have been there a little bit more. I do know a few studies, mostly on the energy side, that engaged more of a kind of peer mechanism, and they did show some more effectiveness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So social norms, there's probably kind of layers there to how you can influence them, where a signage and like what you kind of showed earlier, which I don't think I can get back to. Right, just seeing a sign where you kind of see what everybody else on your floor is doing is really different than having someone directly be like, this is what's happening.
Exactly, yeah. Especially if it's one of your own peers and it's not the building manager or management, who in a lot of, again, in rental context, you're paying rent, so you expect that the staff will do things for you, right? But if it's your peer, it's your neighbor, there's a little bit more of an accountability there, I think.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes me nervous just thinking about it. Like, oh no, was I the one that put the pizza box in the wrong place?
Right. Exactly.
One other question. So in that context, you can kind of have some peer input, but we keep talking about the building management and an important role that they play. So do you have a sense for just like how much time it takes for them to do these things? They have lots of other responsibilities. Recycling is probably pretty low on the ladder in terms of building management, or does it really vary by building how much time they spend?
It really varies. Yeah, it really varies, and you do need a lot of time. It's really time intensive. I can speak to the buildings that we studied for this work, and they were, in terms of classifying them across other New York City buildings, fairly high-end buildings. So I mean, they have a huge staff. So the building manager is not the only person. There's a whole set of people who are doing things throughout the day across the building. So we had the building manager reporting to us the number of bags and the number of bales every week, but they were being counted by various people who were actually collecting them, and they have enough staff to empty every floor of the building multiple times a day, the recycling bins. So it's a pretty intense operation. And that's the sort of high end capacity. But if you don't have that, it's really up to residents to kind of just sort of put things in potentially one room for the whole building, instead of a floor by floor situation, in which case, things can get, I imagine, messy and disorganized, and perhaps you only have a superintendent and a building manager and they're really doing everything. Then, as you mentioned, then the recycling piece really falls pretty low on the list of priorities when you're fixing things and really keeping the building running. The heating system becomes more important than the recycling in January, for instance. So
yeah, that's a lot of time and manpower to be able to do that. It's also a lot of waste.
Yes.
I guess they're not waiting until things are full, I would hope. Or do you think
right? No, well, I think some buildings have to, because they don't have capacity to empty very frequently. But in the buildings that we studied, they never wanted things to be full on the residents' floors because they didn't want overflowing messes. So that's why they had staff who were emptying them multiple times per day. Yeah, but even, even in those buildings, people will decide to throw out, like an armchair, you know what I mean? So you see things like that just sort of set out in the waste room, and somebody has to deal with it. So, again, the multifamily segment is just so challenging in managing all of those people, right, and all of the stuff that they throw out or recycle, and getting it out to the street, and hopefully getting it to the right place so that it is properly disposed of or recycled. So it's a big lift.
Yeah. Well, having talked about all of this, what do you think? And not all of us live in multifamily buildings. And maybe some people listening do, but what do you think is important to know if people are looking to improve the recycling, or what do you think is kind of the key takeaway from what you've done that you think people should know?
First, that your efforts really do matter. I think as people, it's kind of human nature to kind of feel overwhelmed by these big environmental problems. Climate change, waste, they're huge problems. And, our brains kind of just sort of shut down in a way, because we can't think of a way to solve it. And we think we're too small of a contributor to really have an impact. But in aggregate, I mean, thinking about the multifamily buildings, you're one of potentially 500 or 600 apartment units in one building, and then you aggregate that up to the city scale. Every resident has an obligation to really try to do this right. And that is really impactful on a broad scale, on a big scale, on a citywide scale. So that's one, I think, important takeaway. And the other is really that, if you are a resident of multifamily buildings, you can be a peer leader. You can kind of step up and engage your neighbors and, lead in that sense and make people accountable. And I know people do that, and maybe it should be more formalized. Maybe it should come from the building management to kind of drive that effort. But I do think there's real potential there for those social norms to be activated in kind of a peer-to-peer way.
Yeah, and maybe get to know your building manager and the people who are doing this, and
absolutely,
for those that have buildings of people who are picking things up off your floor multiple times a day.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. Absolutely.
That sounds like a lot. Well, I can pause there. That's kind of runs through some of the questions that we had discussed. I haven't seen any questions come in the chat, but now would be a great time if anybody on has any questions, if you want to type them into the chat for Dr. Hewitt. I think she'd be happy to answer them. And in the meantime, I do have some other questions. And I think one of them is kind of goes back to the policy and just like how to make this work in multifamily buildings. Or maybe I'm not looking at the right spot of the chat. But how can you get this accomplished if for some of those lower income buildings, or those buildings, that don't have as many resources as the really fancy high-rise buildings? What is the best thing for them to do in order to make changes?
So one of the things that has been found, in particular coming out of research from New York City, from NYCHA, from the New York City Housing Authority and the Department of Sanitation from a while ago, is that the biggest hurdle to recycling in low-income housing is they're really structural things. It's just stuff like having the bins where you need them and being able to find them and having them labeled properly. So, kind of giving resources to get those basic structural things in place first is really it's the low-hanging fruit, and it's, I think, the most important thing for low-income buildings. And then, only when you get to the kind of higher end buildings, that's when you need to look beyond the structural factors, because those things are already really well in place. because building managers have the capacity in those types of buildings. So that's when you can kind of experiment with things like social norms, right? So you can't even really look to the social norms piece in the low income buildings until you have the really basic structural stuff in place. They have enough bins there where they're supposed to be, people can find them, you know, that kind of stuff. So that's that. I think in my mind, that's the biggest piece.
Yeah. All right. Well, I found the questions, and there are some in here. So I think this. Here's one question of just how engaged is the recycling vendor to improve outreach and education? I guess I'm guessing the recycling vendor would be the people on the back end who are actually doing the collecting, but maybe it also and it's not necessarily the building vendor, but you know the other groups.
Kind
maybe
of private vendors that the city would contract with to collect recycling, I think. You know, in my work, not for this study, but we have another large project with the state, DEC, through the Waste Data and Analysis Center that I co-direct. And, you know, we find really engaged partnerships, really engaged kind of private sector vendors and waste carters who are really interested in the work that we're doing, really interested in improving things. So I think there is engagement. I don't think everybody necessarily knows what to target and how and when. And I think the behavioral piece, as a social scientist, I think that gets overlooked a lot. But there definitely is a desire and an intention to do better and to, you know, see more recycling, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then another question, since the recycling is on each floor, who is responsible for bringing the collections to the collection point? I think we sort of covered that.
Yeah, so that's, oh, go ahead. Was there another part?
I think kind of there's a few questions here, but I think the one that maybe we could get to is it's going to be different in different buildings. In this case, you know, that was the situation, but in a different context or in this context, you know, do the programs need to be different depending on who's doing that activity?
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. And that's, you know, one of our biggest takeaways is that you can't replicate this intervention in any kind of building. You have to do kind of a deep dive and a really, you know, baseline assessment of all of that in the building. How is recycling managed? Where do people put it every day? Do they put it on their floor? Do they have to take it down to the basement? Who is managing taking it out? How often is it done? All of that stuff needs to be assessed before you can determine how you might structure any kind of an intervention. So, you know, I can speak just to my own experience living in different buildings in New York City before I moved out closer to Stony Brook, where I am now. And, you know, the range of configurations and situations varies. Everything from, you know, this is a small sort of 5-unit building and the residents need to take their recycling directly out to the bins on the street and just put it in there. And the building owner kind of hopes that the residents are doing it correctly so he doesn't get fined, to one giant room on kind of the first floor of a larger building where everybody has to bring everything down. And then there's a superintendent or someone who can sort it properly and put it out on the designated day. To something like what we saw in our study where, you know, residents only need to kind of walk down the hall and they just drop things in the garbage room, either down the chute if it's municipal solid waste, if it's not MSW, throwing it in a recycling bin, and then, you know, they're kind of done with their piece. So all of those configurations exist across the board. And so it's really hard to say how to replicate an intervention until you know which of those situations you're looking at, right? And how to engage people and where they're going to see any kind of graphic that you might use, and how to be effective.
Yeah. So I have a couple questions that really are just focused on the study. So like, how long was the messaging period?
The messaging period was 12 weeks.
And can you explain any more about the buildings? You know, were they equivalent size? The demographics were the same?
Were they what? I didn't hear the first part of your
question.
Were
the demographics across buildings the same? Or what were the demographics?
Yep, so the demographics are generally the same. Both buildings are young fairly high income professionals, lots of 2-person households without children, you know, kind of couples without kids, a few young children households, generally high income, highly educated, liberal populations. Sort of mirrors what you see in the city, in large parts of New York City as a whole. Yeah.
Looking at the low income spaces and the high income spaces, do you find that in a low income space that has the necessary structural supports, you know, the really active building manager and that sort of thing, if those are in place, do you think you would see comparable participation and comparable success to a high income building that had that structure in place?
I don't see why not. I mean, I think you know, when you make things easy for people to do it, it's easier for people to recycle. And so if there's support for those structural factors, I think that can certainly happen. That's also, you know, taking, you know, there does need to be an acknowledgement that if there's sort of other burdens on people in low income housing, you know, for instance, energy costs take up a much higher proportion of low income residents' monthly salary than in a high income building, right? So there's more of a burden to kind of weigh things differently, think about, you know, your efforts differently, your usage differently. So there's certainly less, I think, capacity to ask people to do that if they're burdened with other things that are, you know, kind of more higher priority life things, right? Recycling kind of falls by the wayside, but certainly just having things structurally in place gives people an easier outlet to do those things.
Mm-hmm. So I think we've talked a lot that it really needs to be on a case-by-case basis. Every building is different. But do you think that there are any kind of interventions that are universal? Is there like a checklist or you know, a list of best practices that would be applicable across a lot of different demographics?
You know, in comparing what I've learned from recycling with what I've learned from energy, some takeaways are just the simplicity of a graphic display. So too much text is not going to get people's attention. Even simple sort of smiley faces and sad faces to designate kind of good and bad behavior. So the more streamlined you can make your graphics and your intervention, I think the more effective they are. And that's a takeaway just, I think, generally from, you know, advertising and marketing as a whole, which I'm not super familiar with, but I think can apply here for sure. I guess that would be my biggest takeaway. Other than that, I don't know that we can kind of cookie cutter anything from this, really. I think it's so specific. You know, I would also say if you're doing sort of two types of interventions, it's really important to make them be almost identical so that you know what you're testing. Otherwise, there's a lot of noise and you can't say for sure that you're testing what you think you're testing. So, you know, in the case of our study, we made the graphics almost identical in the two buildings with the exception of the data point. And so I think doing things like that, and that's a best practice also from previous studies and, you know, just interventions in general. If you want to study a particular phenomenon, right, you have to kind of control for everything else that's going on. So there's some sort of very basic best practices,
Yeah. So this other one, I think kind of looking at the survey responses, it sounds like most of the feedback from residents was positive.
Mm-hmm.
But did you get any feedback from residents that were opposed to the recycling, either because they don't believe in it or because they don't think it's worthwhile?
No, we did not. No, but I think that's also, there's a little bit of a, I guess I could call it a bias, just doing this type of work in, you know, New York City, one of the most liberal cities in the US. You're going to find a population that's pretty inclined to be environmental and recycle. So I think that that's not super surprising to me. We did find some people who reported that they either didn't notice our interventions or they didn't care about them, or they said they weren't effective. So that we got a little bit of a negativity on that, but it wasn't a large percentage of the respondents. But no one reported that they either don't recycle or don't think it's important, or don't believe that we need to care about waste, that kind of stuff.
Here, this is one question. I don't know that you can answer it, but maybe. What do you think the recycling? Do you think there would be a change in the recycling rates when the collection container is on the floor versus if residents have to go to the basement or go someplace else to be able to recycle?
Yeah, for sure. I think people are more inclined to throw it in the garbage in their own apartment if they aren't sure if maybe this is recyclable, maybe not, I'm not sure. They'll just throw it out. You know what I mean? Because I have to walk too far to go all the way to the basement to figure it out. It's that kind of thing. So there is a kind of a hurdle, not an information hurdle so much, but more of just an effort hurdle that we have to get over. And sometimes people will take the easiest path forward, and that's not always what we want from an environmental perspective. So I do think that matters a lot, the configuration of the building, whether it's on their floor or maybe it's every other floor and they just need to go down a flight of stairs, or maybe it's only one for the building, and then that's different motivators there.
So what would you consider recycling a success in multifamily buildings? Most municipalities only get maybe 50%, maybe less than that in terms of how much recycling, and I don't think that necessarily accounts for contamination. So how much more is good enough?
That's a great question. I mean, I'd like to say I think we should shoot for 100%, right? But that's what we want to see as researchers and people working in this field. And I don't know that we'll ever get to perfect, but I certainly think there's room for significant improvement. I mean, to set the number aside, I think, to me, a successful arrangement or a successful outcome for a multifamily building is one where the building management is handling what they need to handle, but where there's clear engagement from the residents to be an active participant in doing the right thing and recycling in the right way. So I would like to see, building managers noticing, say, less contamination, so that there's not as much of a burden on them to go and then resort materials, for instance. And just more of maybe a collaborative relationship between the building management and residents. And I don't know what that would lead to in terms of an actual percentage increase, but I would hope to see a little bit of a bump there.
Yeah. Well, and then just thinking about the contamination, and the contamination that you saw, can you speak any to ways to reduce contamination in multifamily? Since your work was really about increasing recycling, but it doesn't necessarily reduce contamination.
Right, and I think the contamination piece is a problem, not just in multifamily. It's really something we see in all of our sorting and sampling work across, New York State even, and I'm sure we would see it elsewhere. So I think it comes down to communicating to people, to residents, to the public from a policy perspective. I think there's not a lot of transparency when rules change, and rules change really often, right, around recycling and what you can recycle and how you should recycle it. And municipalities change from dual stream to single stream. And, when residents can't keep up or they're unsure, they will throw it out or not recycle correctly. And so I think, reducing contamination really is about a partnership between, municipalities and residents and the public and policymakers, and thinking about better ways to communicate. I really think the communication piece is key.
Yeah, and then using the clear graphics, right? Happy face, bad, sad face, what not to recycle, perhaps.
Yeah.
to be able to help with some of those issues. For the buildings that you worked with, do they have any, I know you said that they didn't, but did they have any monetary incentives, you know, or are there buildings where there is kind of a financial incentive to be able to divert more or reduce contamination?
I would say not an incentive so much as a penalty, because New York City will fine building owners if, you know, waste is not sorted properly. So in small buildings, you know, that's more impactful because, you know, the building owner perhaps just owns a single, you know, walk-up building with like 4 units. And so they're really feeling it if they're getting a ticket because the residents are not, or their tenants are not sorting properly. But there are no kind of programs that I'm aware of that are giving any kind of bonus or, you know, monetary incentive or any kind of, I don't know, tax break for the building, any kind of structural thing like that to kind of motivate better recycling.
Mm-hmm.
So it's challenging.
Mm-hmm. One of the attendees suggested that when in doubt, throw it out is a good good phrase to live by if you're looking to reduce contamination.
Right, exactly. You know, people, I'm sure much of the audience has heard of this term wish cycling, right? Like people tend to recycle it because they hope it's recyclable, right? So that's why in my photos here where you see the recycling contaminating the MSW, yeah, that one, I see tons of like plastic bags because people think it's plastic. They can, I hope this is recyclable, I'll just throw it in here. And, you know, paper cups from their coffee, things that in our mind, and maybe it's not wish cycling so much as just confusion, again, because of rule changes and not just rules changing, but packaging and product you know, changing the way that things are structured. And so, you know, previously milk cartons could be recycled and now they can't because of the, you know, the lining. And so keeping that all straight, I think, is hard for people. And so it's not intentional. I don't think people are intentionally trying to contaminate the stream. I think there's really just a mismatch between what they can do and what they think they can do.
Yeah, and then I don't know that we really covered the last picture you had here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you want to say anything more about this.
Let me look at it with you here. Let's see. Yeah, so then this is stuff that my team found that could have been recycled that was thrown in the trash, right? So you see lots of aluminum foil, lots of paper. So, you know, maybe it's because people think the aluminum foil was already used for cooking and it's dirty, so therefore I can't recycle it, I have to throw it out. The paper, maybe the paper had grease on it, the bags had, you know, from takeout food, and so same thing, they thought it should be thrown out. Or maybe they just couldn't make it downstairs to the bin, you know what I mean? So there are all sorts of reasons why, but this is the kind of stuff that we are seeing. And we see this everywhere, you know, not just from New York City multifamily.
Yeah, contamination in a sense goes both ways. The wrong things are ending up in the recycling, and then the right things are also ending up in the trash that we want to recover because there's a reason that we try and collect them.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think we're getting close to time. I don't have too many more questions, but I think we can possibly circle back with people on their specific questions if we need to. And do you have any other kind of last thoughts, Dr. Hewitt?
No, just I'm always happy to chat about this stuff or about my work, what we found from our multifamily study. So I'm always happy to get emails or talk further if anybody has additional ideas or thoughts and can brainstorm a little bit.
Awesome. Well, I think kind of with that, I think if people are looking for Dr. Hewitt's contact information, they could certainly reach out to EREF and we should be able to provide that to you. And I think with that, this concludes EREF's science session. And we would like to thank Dr. Hewitt for her time and her expertise and for joining us all today. As a reminder, you will receive an email from EREF through GoToWebinar later today. And please take a moment to complete the brief survey, and then you'll be able to download your certificate. We appreciate your feedback to help us improve our science sessions. And thank you all so much for your participation, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Susie, for having me.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.